താങ്ക് യു വെരി മച്ച്. അദ്ദേഹം പറഞ്ഞപോലെ ഇന്നലെ ഞാൻ കേരള നവോത്ഥാനവും നമ്മളുടെ വൈക്കം സത്യാഗ്രഹം കുറിച്ച് പ്രസംഗിക്കാൻ അവസരമുണ്ടായി. ഇന്ന് രാവിലെ പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് നമ്മളുടെ ഡിസ്റ്റിങ്വിഷ് സ്പീക്കേഴ്സിന് മുമ്പിൽ KPCC അധ്യക്ഷനും ആവശ്യപ്പെട്ടതായിരുന്നു എൻഡ്യൂറിങ് ലെഗസി ഓഫ് ആർ നാഷണലിസ്റ്റ് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റിനെ കുറിച്ചൊരു രണ്ട് വാക്ക് പറയാം. ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ കണ്ടംപററി പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ ചാലഞ്ചസിനെ ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടിട്ട് എന്താ പറയേണ്ടതെന്നാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഇംഗ്ലീഷായിരിക്കും പ്രസംഗം അവർക്കും കേൾക്കാൻ. ആൻഡ് എനിക്ക് പാർലമെൻറ്റിൽ തിരിച്ചെത്താൻ ഇന്ന് അടുത്ത ഫ്ലൈറ്റ് ഡൽഹിക്ക് 11:45 അതുകൊണ്ട് 11 മണിയാകുമ്പോഴേക്കും എയർപോർട്ട് എത്തണം. അതുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ ഇവിടുന്ന് സംസാരിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് വേദിയിൽ നിന്ന് ഇറങ്ങും, എന്നെ ക്ഷമിക്കണം. I just am apologizing in advance that I will have to speak and leave immediately to catch the flight to Delhi for Parliament. I had missed yesterday afternoon Parliament in order to be here to inaugurate a session on the Kerala Renaissance last night. And this morning I will offer you my contribution to talking about the enduring legacy of the nationalist movement in relation to contemporary political challenges, and leave the thoughts with you. I'm sure you will all have very interesting things to say, and it's my loss not to hear you, but I will have no choice but to leave for the airport. Apologies in advance. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here as part of this discussion, and sadly, we are living today in an India which has willfully turned blind to the ideals which animated our nationalist movement, and which are those enshrined in our Constitution as well. As members of the Indian National Congress, it's incumbent upon us, now more than ever, to understand what our nationalist movement meant and what it represented. For the Congress was not just the principal vehicle for our freedom struggle, it was also its legatee, responsible for translating into reality the dreams and aspirations of millions of Indians after independence, going about the task of nation building under circumstances that were truly unfavorable in 1947, and that's why their success has been truly awe-inspiring. As the disciples of Mahatma Gandhi, holding aloft the flame of freedom, set out to extract India from the cesspool of misery that nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule had plunged us into, the nationalist movement had to embody the values that emerged from that crucible of the struggle for independence. Indeed, there is no question that partition had a very deep and searing effect on that ethos, because our partition occurred at a time when there were other partitions happening in the world. East and West Germany, North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam all got partitioned within a few years before or after our partition. But whereas they divided on ideological lines, communist control on one side, capitalist control on the other, or democracy on one side, communist rule on the other, or North and South, or East or West, geography as a divide, in India, none of those factors applied. We were partitioned on the basis of a dispute on one simple principle: should religion be the determinant of our nationhood? So those who believed that their religion determined their national identity, they created Pakistan and they left our country. And those who believed that the freedom struggle was for everybody and that we would have to create a country for everybody, they led India and they created a constitution in which it didn't matter what your religion was, your language was, your caste was, your region of the country was. If you were Indian, you were an Indian citizen, you had the same rights as everybody else. That ultimately was the determining factor. And at the same time, of course, after dousing the infernal flames of the partition bloodbath and the migration of people, there was also the integration into the Union of India of over 500 princely states. You remember that Tiruvidankur didn't even want to join the Union initially, and there was a great challenge in bringing them in. There were the droves of refugees who were streaming ceaselessly across our freshly lacerated borders. There was a war in the first year after independence in Kashmir, and at the same time, other challenges, including that of drafting this constitution. But all of this meant that while the nationalist struggle had culminated in independence, independence was also a beginning and not just a culmination of a new, arduous, agonizing struggle. Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, had precisely this in mind when he said that, and I quote, "The future is not one of ease or resting, but of incessant striving so that we may fulfill the pledges we have so often taken and the ones we shall take today." And in embarking on this path, Nehru and his comrades, some of whom were not from the Congress, in fact, his cabinet had a lot of non-congressmen in it, in line with the Mahatma's view that independence had come to the whole nation and not just to one party, he toiled relentlessly to breathe life into the dream that they had dreamt during the nationalist struggle. So there is no doubt that much of what we've achieved in our history as a democratic republic is owed in large measure to the idea of India envisaged during our freedom struggle, the idea I've described to you today. And everything we take pride in, everything we seek to safeguard, emanates in one way or another from our nationalist movement. In order to denigrate the Congress, our current ruling dispensation has sought to pit such illustrious figures as Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel against Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi and their beliefs. Nehru, in particular, has been demonized in people's eyes, and of course, in the versions of WhatsApp history and the kind of history that we were never taught at school because it never happened, he has been loathed by the supporters of the ruling party today as power-hungry and venal, immoral and inept, none of which, of course, reflects a fraction of the reality. But weaponizing our history, which is a seemingly favorite pastime, will not help the ruling party. That India has endured as a sovereign and syncretic democratic republic for all these decades bears witness to the fact that these men, admired by many, animated by many a shared ideal, were comrades in a common cause. And of course, building the future of the newly liberated nation was again animated by the values and ideals that had sustained the movement. That vision of India is today imperiled, if not fundamentally challenged, by the advocates of Hindu Rashtra and the Hindutva ideology. I would argue that it is owing to that vision of our founding fathers and mothers that we both attained our freedom and persevered, despite daunting challenges, as a democratic republic. Any effort whatsoever to dispense with that legacy would be calamitous for the future of India. And with India having recently completed 76 years of independence, the milestones and celebrations that accompany it offer a timely reminder of how far we have come from that momentous moment at midnight on 15th August 1947, when independent India was born and our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, proclaimed a tryst with destiny. A moment, he said, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. With those words, he launched India on a remarkable experiment in governance. Remarkable because it was happening at all. India, after all, Winston Churchill had once barked, is merely a geographical expression. It is no more a single country than the equator. Well, Churchill was rarely right about India, but it's true that no other country in the world embraces the extraordinary mixture of ethnic groups, the profusion of mutually incomprehensible languages, the varieties of topography and climate, the diversity of religious and cultural practices, and the range of levels of economic development that India has. And yet, the Indian nationalist movement forged these all together into one. An India that came out in 1947 is much more than the sum of its contradictions. Of course, thinking about our country makes clear the immensity of the challenge of defining what it means to be an Indian. How can we define a land of snow peaks and tropical jungles with 23 major languages and 22,000 distinct dialects, including some spoken by more people than speak Danish or Norwegian, inhabited as the world's most populous nation in the third decade of the 21st century by 1.4 billion individuals of every ethnic extraction known to humanity? How does one gauge a culture which elevated nonviolence to an effective moral principle during the freedom movement, but whose freedom was still born in blood and whose independence soaks still in it? How can one determine the future of an ageless civilization that was the birthplace of 4 major religions, a dozen different traditions of classical dance, 85 major political parties, and 300 ways of cooking the potato. The short answer is that it can't be done, at least not to everyone's satisfaction. Any truism about India can be immediately contradicted with another truism about India. It's often jokingly said that anything you can say about India, the opposite is also true. Our country's national motto, emblazoned on our governmental crest, is Satyameva Jayate, truth alone triumphs. But the question remains, however, whose truth? It is a question to which there are at least 1.4 billion answers if the last projections haven't misled us, since we don't have a census in 21. Sadly, instead of Satyameva Jayate, our current ruling dispensation appears to adhere only to Sattameva Jayate. Satta in Hindi lo parnale adhikarama. Sattameva Jayate na avile vishwasam. They would do well to learn the difference between these two ideas. But this sort of answer is no answer at all, and so another answer to those questions has to be sought. And this may lie in a simple insight. The singular thing about India is that you can only speak of it in the plural. There are, in the hackneyed phrase, many Indias. And I must say, what is special about our country is that everything exists in countless variants. There is no single standard, no fixed stereotype, no one way of doing things. All groups, faiths, tastes, and ideologies survive in our pluralist system and contend with each other for their place in the sun. And it's a matter of pride that at a time when most developing countries opted for authoritarian models of government to promote nation building and to direct development, India chose to be a multi-party democracy. And despite many stresses and strains, including, of course, the period of the emergency and even the current crisis, when foreign analysts of democracy are saying that India is no longer a democracy but an electoral autocracy, where we elect our autocrats freely, but once they come to power, they rule as dictators and not as democrats. Despite all of that, we are still a multi-party democracy, freewheeling, rumbustious, corrupt and inefficient perhaps, but nonetheless flourishing. And that's the India that will go to the polls nationally in a few months' time. One result of all this is that observers outside have often seen India as a maddening, inefficient, chaotic, and seemingly unpurposeful country as it muddles through into the third decade of the 21st century. This is the critique that Mr. Modi and his like seem to be responding to when they claim that they have transformed our country's governing ethos. But another way of looking at it is that India is not just a country, it's an adventure, one in which all avenues are open and everything is possible. India, wrote the British historian E.P. Thompson, is perhaps the most important country for the future of the world. All the convergent influences of the world, he wrote, run through this society. There is not a thought that is being thought in the East or the West that is not active in some Indian mind. Now, I'm glad a Brit said that and not an Indian. That Indian mind has been shaped by remarkably diverse forces, ancient Hindu tradition, myth and scripture, the impact of Islam and Christianity, and 2 centuries of British colonial rule. The result is unique. Many observers abroad have been astonished by India's survival as a pluralist state. But India could hardly have survived as anything else. This, above all, has been the most enduring legacy of our nationalist movement. Those visionaries knew that if we can march forward with our infinite differences intact, without imposing on anybody any one identity, only then will we succeed as a democratic nation. Pluralism is a reality that emerges from the very nature of the country. It's a choice made inevitable by India's geography and reaffirmed by its history. And this means that the idea of India is very unusual in today's world. The fact is that if you look at all the classic theories of nationalism, India doesn't conform to any of them. Our nationalism is not based on language, since we have at least 23 in the Constitution, or 35 Indian languages spoken by more than 1 million people each, according to the ethnographers. It is not based on geography, the natural geography of the subcontinent, framed by the mountains and the sea, the Himalayas and the oceans, was hacked by partition. It is not based on ethnicity, because the Indian accommodates a diversity of ethnic types in which many Indians have more in common with foreigners than with other Indians. Indian Punjabis and Bengalis, for instance, have more in common with Pakistanis and Bangladeshis ethnically than they do with Poonawallas and Bangaloreans. And it is not based on religion. Lest we forget, we are home to every faith known to mankind practically. And Hinduism is a faith without a national organization, no established church, no ecclesiastical hierarchy, no Hindu Pope, no Hindu Mecca, no Hindu Sunday, because we can worship our Ishtadevtas any day of the week, no uniform beliefs or modes of worship, and so Hinduism exemplifies as much our diversity as it does our common cultural heritage. So Indian nationalism is the nationalism of an idea, the idea of what one might call an ever land, emerging from an ancient civilization, united by a shared history, sustained by pluralist democracy under the rule of law. And this land imposes no narrow conformities on its citizens. You can be many things and one thing. You can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, and a good Indian all at once. In fact, when I was dealing with the Yugoslav civil war at the United Nations, I discovered everyone was using the Freudian notion of the narcissism of minor differences. That is, that how the same descendants of the same Slavic peoples who had settled the Balkan Peninsula between the 7th and 11th centuries were busy massacring each other over very small differences. And I would today say that the interesting thing is, whereas in Yugoslavia you saw conflict over minor differences, in India we have commonality of major differences. To turn Michael Ignatieff's famous phrase on its head, we are a land of belonging rather than of blood. So the idea of India that came from the nationalist movement is of one land embracing many. It is the idea that our nation may endure differences of caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, costume, and custom, and still rally around a consensus. And that consensus is a democratic one around the simple principle that in a democracy under the rule of law, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. The reason that India had survived all the stresses and strains that had beset it for 76 years and that led so many foreigners to predict our imminent disintegration as a country is that we maintained consensus on how to manage without consensus. Today, some in positions of power seem to be questioning those ground rules, and that sadly is why it is more essential for the Congress to reaffirm them now. What knits that entire idea of India today is the rule of law established in the Constitution and a commitment to democracy anchored in what I have called in my book, The Battle of Belonging, civic nationalism. That is, a nationalism that owes allegiance to the Constitution and democratic institutions and not to any ethnic or religious identity. So our nationalism, as the Congress and the national movement came up with it, is civic nationalism, where every citizen has the same rights, and the BJP's idea of nationalism is increasingly an ethno-religious nationalism anchored in Hindutva and Hindu identity. This is very tragic because indeed our own constitution is what enabled the social changes that have kept India evolving. If today we have the story of a Dalit woman who has been chief minister 3 times in the most populous Hindi-speaking state of India, that is Srimati Mayawati. And indeed, if today we have a former chaiwala who has become Prime Minister of India in Sri Modi, that is a testament to the democracy and diversity that was promoted by our national movement. We've had social change, we've had economic change, we've had economic change from moving from a protectionist economy to liberalization. We've had a political transformation through the rise of Hindu nationalism. All of these things by themselves could have led to a revolution in some other country, but in India, our democracy, our constitution has contained them, managed them, and allowed them to coexist peacefully. So exactly 70 years after Nehru first spoke of that tryst with destiny, our incumbent Prime Minister spoke of a new India during the Independence Day address to the nation that he delivered in 2017. And what is this new India that he's urging us to create? He spoke of an India free from the shackles of casteism and communal tension, an India that successfully solves its endemic problems of corruption, nepotism, terrorism, an India where every man, woman, and child would be given an empowered and dignified standard of living, thanks to a society that harnesses India's entrepreneurial spirit to become an economic powerhouse. But this idea of India, we have nothing really to disagree with the Prime Minister. He's merely reiterating the historic commitment to the freedoms that were preserved and guaranteed and developed and instituted by the old India. In the old India, which our nationalist movement fought for, the fundamental premise that was ultimately forged was that of access to a historically inalienable set of freedoms. The freedom of choice being prime, the freedom to choose what government you wanted, the freedom to choose what set of convictions to resonate with, the freedom to choose whom to love and how to love, the freedom to choose what to wear, what to eat, what to drink, what to speak, the freedom to move freely within the sovereign borders of the Republic, and the freedom to determine whether Ram or Rahim or Jesus or Jehovah or none of them was the force that guided and moved the cosmos. All of these were freedoms embedded in our Constitution, and not just in the letter and spirit of the law, but into the lived experience of India and its peoples. But as usual, between the rhetoric of the current ruling dispensation and the reality on the ground, there falls a great shadow. For all these statements and ideals, one is struck by the complete lack of any sense of how we're going to achieve this. There's plenty of evidence of the opposite. Whether it is the Achhe Din of 2014, or the New India of 2017, or the Amrit Kal and Vishwaguru Bharat of today, under the BJP, these phrases appear to be mere smokescreens for the real agenda that this government has pursued since coming to power, because the road to New India appears littered with the wreckage of all that was good and noble about the old India. In its place, an ugly distortion of the ideals of the nationalist movement is rising, an India where a particularly dangerous form of ethno-nationalism is being fostered, an India where a narrow-minded majoritarianism is being incubated, and where incidents of communal violence driven by mob lynching zealots and Gaurakshak vigilantes proliferate. In fact, what we are seeing now, in the words of Pratap Bhanu Mehta, is a republic of fear for many of our citizens. Now, we in the Congress want a new India too, but it'll be a new India where you won't get lynched for the food you eat, marginalized for the faith you hold dear, criminalized for the person you love, and imprisoned for making use of the fundamental rights guaranteed to you by your own constitution. Instead, we must look forward to a new India that celebrates and welcomes pluralism. The idea vindicated by our nationalist movement. It must be a new India fundamentally rooted in their idea of India. As I've often asked in a different context, if you don't know where you're coming from, how will you appreciate where you're going? This nebulous idea of India, though the phrase is Rabindranath Tagore's, is actually as old as antiquity itself. And the truth is that it is anchored in our culture and civilization as much as in the politics of our nationalist movement. But Indian democracy imposes no narrow conformities on its citizens. The Indian notion of pluralism holds that you can be many things and one thing. And for India to succeed, you should be free to have your own identities, which are secured by the overall national identity of India. Only by upholding that established commitment towards a democratic and syncretic ethos can New India fulfill the aspirations of all Indians. And that means keeping the government out of our bedrooms, keeping the government out of our kitchens, keeping the government out of our dining rooms, and keeping the government out of our mobile phones, where of course they very much are. Now, at the same time, we must be conscious that preserving our ideological commitment to pluralism, to acceptance, and to the freedom provided by our democratic system is only one half of the battle. Providing a decent standard of living for the people of India, particularly for those from economically vulnerable groups, is our commitment as the Congress Party in undertaking our blueprint for a new India. We must overcome our poverty. We have to deal with the hardware of development, the ports, the roads, the airports that Mr. Modi's government is so proud they're improving, but also with the software of development, the human capital that they are much less effective at. The need for ordinary Indians to be able to have a couple of square meals a day, to be able to send their children to a decent school, to aspire to jobs that will give them opportunities in their lives to transform themselves. So it's not enough that you find the BJP government talking about GDP growth and increasing per capita income. That is merely a reflection of the prosperity of some and not the income and the jobs of the many. Because people don't have jobs, we have the highest rate of unemployment in our country today. I've often pointed out, what is per capita income? If Mr. Ambani and Mr. Adani walk into this room right now, all our per capita incomes would go up because their income would be added to ours and divided. The moment they walk out, we go back to being as poor as we always were. That is the reality that many Indians are suffering, and that's something we have to face. At the same time, we have to conquer these real challenges that we can't pretend don't exist. And it's being sought to be brushed under by the present government under the triumphant, imaginative rug of a Vishwaguru India, which unfortunately, as you know, has been challenged by recent court actions in the United States and in Qatar, as well as accusations made by the Prime Minister of Canada, which does not suggest that the Vishwaguru is teaching anybody anything abroad. Now, at the same time, as the custodians of our future, the government of India has a duty to ensure that our journey takes place in an open and inclusive society, in a rich and diverse and plural civilization, one that is open to the disputation of ideas and interests within it, and one that's unafraid of the prowess or the products of the outside world. This new India ought to be wedded to our constitution and to the diversity and democracy that are our greatest strengths. That is the kind of India that we inherited from the nationalist movement, and I must say, it is the kind of India that is being seriously challenged by those in power today. One could argue that their chauvinism, their anti-minority violence is a very specific challenge of a particular section of the polity. But the truth is that they are seeking very much to appeal only to narrow identities. Our nationalist discourse has argued that every one of us, whatever religion, whatever language, whatever color of skin we have the same claim to being Indian as anyone else. Today, the very suggestion that only a Hindu, and that too only a certain kind of Hindu, can be an authentic Indian is an affront to the very premise of Indian nationalism. An India that is denied to some of us could be denied to all of us. And I must say that as the past is used by some to haunt the present, the cycle of violence goes on, spawning new hostages to history, ensuring that future generations will be taught new wrongs to set right. So to conclude, what should be the animating idea of our version of New India? The idea of one nation made up of countless different kinds of people, an India where it doesn't matter what religion you practice, what language you speak, what caste you were born in, what color your skin is. Not only must we respect all of these, but when we should value unity, it should not be what they value, which is uniformity. We believe in an India that unites our people. They seek to divide us on religious grounds. Our ideology binds people together. Theirs separates one Indian from another. What we need in New India is the strengthening of democratic institutions at all levels, with transparency and accountability enhanced through the Right to Information Act and a vital, vigorous parliament. They've sought to weaken parliament and other democratic institutions. They've hollowed out the RTI, and they've promoted an atrocious personality cult around one-man rule. We want an India which will empower people and harness their collective strength in the pursuit of national objectives. They want a leader who sees people as instruments of his own power. So we want to derive strength from all sections of our society, where they speak of one faith and one language, reducing everyone to second-class citizens. Their idea of a new India is one of exhortation. Make in India, digital India, start up India, stand up India, sit down India, shut up India. Our new India must be one of consultation. We must never speak of India shining as they once did without asking who is India shining for. Our new India must follow policies that both promote higher economic growth and also ensure that the benefits of our growth are enjoyed by the poor and disadvantaged sections of our society. So the choice coming up in the elections of 2024 is clear. We can have a new India that belongs to all of us, led by a government that works for all of us, or we can have a new India that belongs to some and serves the interests of a few. We can choose a new India that embodies hope or one that promotes fear, a new India united in striving or an India divided by hatred. I would argue that just as this topic today suggests, we need an India that is anchored in the founding values of the nationalist movement in its response to contemporary challenges. And there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that if we were to live up to those ideals, live up to the letter and the spirit of our Constitution, then India will truly shine once again, but it will shine for all. Thank you very much, and I wish this conference great success in its second day. Jai Hind, Jai Congress.